Hey guys, Justin here with JHart Modelworks, and in this video we're going to be focusing on the chassis. We're going to modify the chassis to take male fitment wheels instead of female, as well as modify the ride height on the front end. We're going to do some prep work on the chassis, modify the drive shaft with some aluminum tubing, clean up and drill out the exhaust tips, add some brake and fuel lines, get the engine installed, as well as some 3D printed rear shocks. And then we're going to get our wheels and brakes assembled and on the chassis as well. We got a lot of work ahead of us. Hopefully you'll have a lot of fun. So grab a snack and let's get started. A lot of the Revell muscle cars use female fitment wheels. For those who may be new, this means we have, like on this kit, we have this round wheel back which goes to the inside of the tire, and then it slides over the post on the chassis. I'm not really a fan of female fitment wheels. For one, it often causes problems trying to add brakes. Like with this kit, trying to add brakes with that inner wheel back, it won't let you set the brakes inside the wheel. It'll push them too far to the inside where they will stick out and they'll look bad. And two, if the wheels don't sit tight on those spindles, they're going to wobble and not sit straight. I prefer the Tamiya style male fitment wheels with a 2mm center post. Now when I buy 3D design files, they often come with female fitment setups that may or may not fit my kit anyway, especially if I resize them like I'm doing with these wheels. So I take them into Blender, I flatten the center mounting setup so that the back of the wheel is perfectly flat. Then when I'm slicing the file to get it ready to print, I put the wheel dead center to the slicer and I add a 2mm diameter post dead center as well. That way I know it's perfectly centered and it won't throw off my wheel. So now I have male fitment wheels, I need to make them work on the kit. Also, I don't really like how far in the wheels sit inside the wheel wells on this kit. Even the original kit wheels sit too far in for me. It just doesn't look right. Even my widened 3D printed wheels leave a gap here. And the fronts are just terrible. I mean, that is a noticeably huge gap. So I've designed these adapters that are also spacers. If you look at the mount posts on the chassis, there are these outer posts, but on the inside, right up to the chassis post, there's a little bit wider section. These adapters are designed to sit right over that inner wider section of post. Now there's a straight one to go on the rear suspension, and the front one here is kind of L-shaped. The center of the chassis mount point is offset by 2mm from the center of the wheel mounting hole. If we install them right, this not only is going to adapt the chassis to male fitment wheels and kick the wheel out slightly, it's also going to lower the front end of the car by 2mm. So first thing we need to do is cut off all 4 mounting posts off the chassis, leaving that slightly wider nub. Cutting on things like this is always a little scary, but there's no going back now. Next, we're going to take a flat 240 grit sanding stick and we're going to sand off all the remains of the outer posts so that the spacers can sit perfectly flat on the nubs. A little test fit, looks like they sit perfectly on the rears. Now these also have a small thin lip at the outer end of the adapter, and that lip perfectly matches the diameter and depth of my 3D printed brake rotors. This way we can glue our rotors and calipers in place and they will sit properly inside the wheel instead of sticking out way back behind the wheels. Now to get these installed. We're going to add a bit of glue to the rear mount point and then press our adapter firmly in place so it sits all the way up against the chassis, and we're going to repeat that for the other side. Now we want these to sit until they're completely dry. We need to dry fit the rear wheels in before installing the front spacers, and we don't want the rear wheels getting glued in place yet. Now, just like the rears, we're going to add glue to the front mount points, but we need to do both at the same time and we need to work very quickly. I'm also using a slower setting CA glue for this to give me a little bit more working time before it sets. Now, I already have the front wheels dry fit into the adapters. It's okay if the tire hole doesn't connect to the chassis mount points, so the glue won't reach the front tires. But when we put the front adapters on, we need to get them lined up so that they fit straight up and down with the wheel being pushed up into the chassis. We want to get them on quickly so we can flip the car over and get everything lined up and make sure the chassis sits flat on all 4 wheels before the glue can set. Once everything's level, we'll leave it there to dry. And that is going to give us the lower front stance that I think looks really aggressive. There should be a set of rear shocks that connect the leaf springs to the chassis. Even AMT's 70 Challenger has these shocks, but Revell's doesn't. I have 3D modeled and printed up a set of rear shocks that are fully articulating. They have mount points at the top and bottom that will allow the inner and outer parts of the shocks to rotate, and the inner and outer shock parts slide in and out, allowing us maximum adjustability to get them seated nicely on the suspension. The portion of the shocks that connects to the chassis has a small mounting post, and we need to drill a hole for it on the chassis in front of the corner of the fuel tank. So we're going to touch the tip of the mount to some water-based paint, and then completely out of frame, we're going to tap that on the chassis right in front of the fuel tank where we want to drill our hole. Now, I apologize for the footage for this entire section. Both I was out of frame, the camera was zoomed in, I think, and the mount for my camera kept sliding down, and I didn't realize that it was slipping, so the angle just keeps tilting back towards the back of my bench. And now that everything's done, I can't re-record it. So I drilled this side too far in, and we're going to re-drill it. At least this time it'll be on camera. We're also going to fill the hole with some super glue. Once it's painted and all the suspension is in place, it won't be seen at all. And we're just going to do a quick test fit to make sure it sits properly. Revell has some of their raised branding molded right in front of the fuel tank here, so we're going to take care of this real quick. We're going to start by marking kind of over the area just to see where it's at. We're then going to come in with a chisel, and we're going to remove most of the raised lettering. Then we're going to follow up with a sander to remove the rest and get it nice and smooth. This is yet another handy spot for my little flat sander. Next up, we're going to modify the drive shaft. Revell has this molded into the rear suspension, but we're going to change that. We're going to start by cutting the drive shaft off where it meets the rear differential. We'll use our dead center tool to start a pilot hole in the rear diff, and then starting with a 0.5 millimeter, we're going to drill a hole in the rear diff. We're going to step up through our bits until we get to about 1.1 millimeters. We're going to use a sander to clean up the end of the diff, then we're going to repeat the process drilling a 1 millimeter hole into the end of the drive shaft. We'll clean that end up as well, and then using some Tamiya Extra Thin, we're going to glue some 1 millimeter styrene rod into our drive shaft end. That extra 1/10 of a millimeter in the diff opening is going to give us some room to insert and rotate our drive shaft. I don't know why, but I like my drive shafts to be able to spin freely. Next, we're going to modify the drive shaft itself. I want to replace the drive shaft with some aluminum tubing. We're going to measure and mark our tubing to get the length we want, and then we're going to cut the tubing to length. Now, I originally bought some stainless steel tubing for this, but nothing I have will cut the stuff. So I switched to some K&S 8102 aluminum tubing. Aluminum is soft enough to cut with a hobby knife. Once we have it cut, we're going to use a flat and round metal file to clean up the ends from any burrs. Before we do any cutting though, we need to get the full length of the original drive shaft. This way when we glue our ends into the aluminum tube, we can be sure that the new drive shaft will be the same length. Now that we have our tube cut and our measurements, we're going to cut the ends off the drive shaft, but we don't want to cut right at the tube end. We want to cut in a bit, leaving some extra material from the original drive shaft intact so that we can glue it inside our new tube. We will then chuck the end of our drive shaft into a cordless drill. Now I like to wrap the end in a good bit of masking tape. This allows the drill to grip the part without doing any major damage to it. And with the drill running like a lathe, we're going to take a flat metal file to the extra section of drive shaft, and we're going to file it down till it fits inside our aluminum tubing. Now you could use a sanding stick for this, but sanding sticks wear out a lot faster than metal files. Now we're going to test to make sure it fits in our tube. And then we'll repeat the process on the other end. Now we're going to add some glue to the inside of the tube and slide our ends into place, making sure we get the length exactly the same as the original kit part. By putting our glue inside the tubing instead of on the outside of the ends, we're not going to have any issues with glue oozing out anywhere. After repainting the ends in some Mr. Surfacer Black, we're going to use some Tamiya sanding sponge to clean up and shine up the aluminum tubing a bit, and our drive shaft is all done. Next, we're going to clean up and modify our exhaust a bit. There is a seam line that runs all the way down every single side of this. I find it easiest to clean up using a sponge sander, and then for the very ends where it's nice and flat, we're just going to use a flat display sander. The exhaust tips aren't great. There's very little detail and the ends are very shallow. We're going to take our dead center tool to start a pilot hole again, and then we're going to step our way through our drill bits going straight into the tips to open them up some more. It's important that we stay completely straight and we don't drill off to the sides or come out of the side anywhere. We want to keep stepping up through our bits until we get an opening that is reasonably thin on the outsides and as deep as we can get it without coming through. At the very least, make sure it's deep enough to hold some flat black paint, but I like to open them up as much as I can. Once we have the tips opened up as much as we can with our drill bits, we're going to come back in with our round metal file and we're going to clean them up and finish opening up as much as we can. We're trying to get them nice and thin without damaging them. This is what we started with, and this is what it looks like after we're finished. With the exhaust done and everything painted up, we're going to move on to adding some brake lines. We're going to use some 22 gauge jewelry wire. I wish I had some that's a little less shiny, but we're going to have to do what we can with what we have. Once we cut a piece off, we're going to bend it around this marker cap to get it smooth and round. Next, we're going to make a couple of marks and we're going to bend the ends so they run straight along the axle. Now we want to make some bends at the end, and I can't really explain this other than we're going to come back up and around to the top center of the axle. I'm not sure when, but apparently I lost the footage where I drilled holes in the top of the hubs here. We're going to bend the other end as well, and we want to work both ends through the holes in the hubs. Again, we drilled holes earlier, I promise. This is quite a bit fiddly. It will end up being a little mangled, but it'll be good enough. Getting the second end through will mangle it a bit, but we're just going to go ahead and straighten that back up. Now we're going to come in with some wire cutters and just cut off the ends. Now to wrap the axle lines up, we're going to take a toothpick and just add a little bit of CA glue to the wire where it should meet up with the axle, and then we'll just press it into place. Now we're going to add some brake lines running from the front of the chassis back to the rear end. I'm going to run a piece of wire out and get a rough measurement and cut it off the spool. I don't really like working on the spool as you have to deal with it flopping around and maybe it hitting and breaking something. It's happened to me before. I tried sanding the wire down with some Tamiya sanding sponge trying to dull it down, but all I really managed to do was sand off the chrome and turn it copper. I didn't realize how bad it was until it was already in place, and I'm just going to deal with it like it is. Next, we're going to drill a 0.8mm hole in the base of where the front subframe meets the floor panel. We want to drill on both sides using the raised panel detail as a guide. The 22 gauge is about 0.6 millimeter diameter, but even with the extra space, it's still going to be a tight fit when we go to fish the wire through the hole. While drilling, you want to make sure that they are exactly opposite from each other, as any deviation side to side will make it even harder to get the wire through. We're actually going to drill 2 sets of openings as we have 2 sets of lines to run. Yeah, try not to break your bit like that. I'm going to save you the agony of watching me try to fish this wire through these holes for like another hour. A lot of excess footage was cut out of here. I will say it is a little easier, not much, if you bend a small curve in the end of the wire to help you fish it through. Now we want to bend the wire to follow a path running along the side of the chassis. This is another long process, and I kept getting out of frame trying to get a better view of what I was doing, and it's still not, incredibly clean. Looking at the footage now, hindsight is 20/20. I'll try to do a better job on it next time. We're going to follow this along the floor pan and disappear it into the suspension. Couldn't find any really good reference shots for the brake lines, so I don't really know where this one terminates. Next, we're going to use a little CA glue, and we're going to tack the line into place several places along the frame, just to keep it from moving so it's nice and secure. Try not to use too much glue, you don't want to make any large messes. Like I said earlier, we do have another one of these to run, and we're going to run it right alongside the first one. This time we're going to disappear this one under the rear axle where it would connect up with the axle lines using a rubber hose, but we're not going to go through all that. Now we're going to hide some of our sins with this aluminum masking sheet by MIG Ammo. It's like a knockoff bare metal foil, but you get a lot more of it per package. It's not nearly as chrome-like, and in my experience, the adhesive was way too sticky for a body. When I tried it on a test body in the past, it ripped up paint and primer trying to remove the excess foil. But for what we're doing here, the aluminum sheet is perfect. We've cut a thin strip of aluminum, we're going to peel it up and cut a small section off. We then want to press it down into place over our lines in some various logical places. We want to see if we can cover some of our glaring glue spots. We're going to burnish it down and then we'll trim off the excess. Now it looks like we have some clamps holding our brake lines down. Finally, for the brake lines, we're going to trim the front end of the line so they can disappear up into the engine bay. Next, we're going to take one of these ferrule fittings from Ted's Modeling Marketplace and we're going to work it onto some Protect braided line. This is going to be used as a fuel line. We want to drill a hole in the side of the fuel tank. We will then run our fuel line into the tank and glue it from the inside. This is going to keep our glue mess down to a minimum. We can then add a touch of CA glue to the braided line on the outside right where it meets the tank and slide the fitting into place so it hides the hole we drilled. And just like the brake lines, we're going to glue down the fuel line running up to the front of the car. But the hole we need to drill at the front is significantly larger. We need to be careful that we don't break the frame or skip off and damage the paintwork. Once we finally get it run to the front, we want to trim the line off near the end of the frame. We'll finish this up later once we get the engine in place. And then, like with the brake lines, we'll wrap this up by adding some aluminum foil clamps, although I did make these a little wider as the fuel line I'm using is a little thicker than the wire I used for the brakes. It's time to mount the engine and the chassis, but first we need to drill a second hole in the bottom of the fuel pump. With that done, we're going to add a small drop of glue on the transmission mount and the engine mount points, and then we'll set the engine into place. We want to make sure everything sits smooth and even. There isn't really any positioning locating points other than the one which is kind of sloppy fitting right at the transmission mount, but the engine mounts should fit fairly evenly on each side of the oil pan. Now we want to make a mark on our fuel line just a bit behind the fuel pump. Then I'm going to grab the fuel line firmly with a pair of pliers before we strip the shielding. If we don't hold the line back here, there's a risk of us yanking against the glue points or slamming the chassis around and breaking something like the engine. We'll then make a 90-degree bend towards the engine, trim off the excess, add a little bit of CA glue to the end, and press it into the fuel pump. You could have added a fitting or wrapped the end of the braiding in something like bare metal foil, but a test fit with the front suspension shows that the suspension covers and hides the entire line. With the engine in place, we can now glue in our front suspension, which is sadly a single piece. But if you take your time with detail painting it in a few different colors, you can really make it look fairly sophisticated. We're going to add a small drop of glue to each of the 4 mount points. There's 2 positive points, and then there's 2 flush mounts. Then just press it home and make sure once again that everything fits flat and flush. If this piece is glued out of alignment, it can throw off our wheel stance. Here's our drive shaft, and the long skinny end is the piece of plastic rod we added earlier, so it goes into the rear axle, which again is a single piece, but can be detail painted up pretty nicely. We're going to slide our drive shaft into place into the axle with no glue, and then we're going to add some glue to the front 2 mount points that sit under the leaf springs. We want to install the rear suspension first, inserting the drive shaft into the end of the transmission again with no glue, and then pressing the locating pins on the leaf springs firmly into their mounting holes. There are 2 more mount points at the back of the leaf springs. We're going to add a small drop of glue to each mount hole and then press the mount pins firmly into place. Again, we need to make sure the rear axle mounts flush and flat. With our rear suspension in place, we can now install our 3D printed fully articulating rear shocks. The design files for these are for sale on my Colts 3D page. That's in the description box below for those with 3D printers. Now the mounting post sticks out just slightly through the chassis, so we will add some CA glue to the mounting hole from the inside. And then we're going to slide the outer portion of the shock into the chassis mount so that it rotates directly towards the leaf spring. Once that's dry, we'll insert the other end of the shock into the tube and position it so that the mount lays right over the leaf spring. Then we can add a drop of glue and position the flat mounting surface into position on the leaf spring. We'll repeat that for the other side, and our shocks are in place. Next up is our exhaust. Now I started with some Mr. Hobby super metallic stainless steel over black surfacer. I then sprayed the pipes and muffler in various areas with some Tamiya clear yellow and some Mr. Hobby clear brown from the GX line. This created a mottled heat stained sepia brownish metal look that I then covered with 3 or 4 super light mist coats of Mr. Hobby clear black to give us this dark stained metal. The tips got some gloss black and then some Mr. Hobby super metallic chrome, then about 6:1 with Mr. Hobby rapid thinner. We want to add some glue to the inside of the mounting holes from inside the chassis. I like to glue from the inside whenever possible. We're also going to put a little glue on the end of each of the exhaust headers. Then we want to press the 2 mounting posts in place through the holes. and line up the end of the exhaust pipes to the headers. And that will take care of the exhaust. This brings us to the brakes and the wheels. Now normally I wait until the final assembly to do these, but with how low the front fenders sit, the front fenders may get in the way, so we're going to go ahead and put them on now. We have a nice set of 3D printed Brembo brakes here. And for our wheels, I've gone with a set of Row RF6 wheels from Real Rims on Colts 3D that I printed up and painted in alclad magnesium to tie in with the fender stripes. I detail painted all the lugs in some Mr. Hobbies Super Rich Gold with a mechanical pencil, and for our tires, I've just gone for a generic street tire with a nice aggressive tread pattern that I sprayed up in Tamiya Rubber Black. Our first order of business is going to be to install some metal valve stems from Mr. Model. There's some raised lettering on one of the small sections here, and our valve stem goes in 2 openings to the right of that lettering. So we will start by drilling a small hole in that space, and while drilling this, we want to be careful that our bit doesn't slip and scratch up our paintwork on the wheels. Now we don't need to go in very deep, just enough to set the valve stem in. These are a magnetic metal, so I find it's easier to work with them if you pull them out with a magnet so they don't roll around everywhere like they would if you just poured them out. And working over a sheet of white paper makes them easier to see if you drop one. Using a sewing pin, we're going to add a tiny drop of CA glue into the hole if my hand will stop shaking. And then we can carefully set our valve stems into place. Now my best advice is don't be like me and don't drink a Monster energy drink shortly before trying to do this. Our tires have a directional tread pattern. We want to install them so that the arrow pattern would rotate towards the front of the car with the wheel in driving mode. We're going to mount our tire on from the front about halfway, then add a couple of small drops of glue onto the wheel and spread it out really thin with something like a toothpick. We can then set the wheel backside down on the bench and press the tire all the way down, then just make sure that the tire is flush and even with the wheel. If we got the glue thin enough, there should be little to no glue mess, and if there is, it'll be on the inside edge where it won't be seen. Next, we want to assemble our brakes. We want to find the least attractive spot on the front face of the brakes and then add a drop of glue to that spot on the back side, and then slide our calipers into place, making sure our Brembo logo will face outward. You might not be able to notice, but I did detail paint the logos using some water-based acrylic dark purple. The brakes are assembled, the wheels are assembled, now we need to attach them to the chassis. We want to add a tiny bit of glue to this small lip on the hub. We'll slide our brakes into place and line them up. I like to line them up so the calipers face towards the center of the body, but what's most important is that they match side to side. Then we'll add a little glue to the inside of the hub and slide our wheels into place. Now when I'm installing the rears on a solid axle like this, I like to press against the axle on the opposite side with my other hand. That way when I'm pushing the wheel into the axle, any force is pushing against my other hand and not against the glue bonds holding the chassis assembly together. Now we're just going to make sure everything sits square on all 4 wheels. And a quick test fit to peek at our ride height. And I gotta say, I like how that looks. And that's going to be a wrap on the chassis. I'm really loving how it's turning out. For a very simple kit, there's the illusion of a lot of great detail, and then we've added quite a bit as well with our brake and fuel lines, our rear shocks, the 3D printed brakes and wheels. We can see that drive shaft peeking out through there. I'm even really happy with how the engine is sitting in there. I will admit I was a little concerned with how that orange was going to look on this anodized purple chassis. I originally thought about doing the engine in black like I do with the Chevys, because I'm not a big fan of Chevy engine orange either. but this really isn't bad looking. From here, we're going to move on to the interior. I have about 80% of it painted and about 50% of it's ready for assembly. Still have a ton of work to do on the dash. So hopefully I'll have that video ready in a couple of weeks. I have given up all hope of doing a video every week with the way my schedule's just going right now. As always, guys, thanks for hanging out and building with me, and I will catch you on the next one.